When we first bring up a router or a switch, first time it's configured, you just get your command prompts. You get your console line. You can go in and do the configuration without ever having to put in any type of authentication. Clearly, in a production environment, we'd want to have passwords set to allow us to control who gets into either our router or our switches. So we need to go in and set both our out-of-band and in-band communication passwords to allow us to have better control of the devices. When we're configuring the passwords inside the routers, we want to think about how we're actually gaining access to the router or the switch. You can either router or switch, it doesn't matter. We still want to protect it. When we first console in, when we first plug a console cable in, we wanted to ask us for a password to get into the router. That would be considered out-of-band management, out-of-band. Using my console port, or on a router I could use my aux port as well for maybe a modem connection, but that would be my console cable or my console line. If we're looking at after we've configured our router or our switch, we've given a switch and IP address, we have a router interface configured, then we can actually telnet or SSH into our device and we can manage it that way. That would be considered in-band. In-band meaning that I'm using my TCP IP. Again, it could be any layer 3 routed protocol, but that means I'm actually using TCP IP to get into my device. And that would typically be on my telnet lines. My telnet line or lines. Again, I'm using that specific word line because that's the configuration mode that we need to get into to actually do our configuration. So out-of-band management, I want to make sure I protect it if you plug your console line in, so I'll set the console line password. If I want to make sure that you are protected, that we don't allow people to log in using TCP, telnetting or SSHing, again, I didn't write it down here, but we can use SSH as our secure shell, then we want to set the telnet line or the SSH line password as well. This just allows us to control how we get into the device itself. Once we're at, this would allow us to get into what we call our user executive mode with the greater than sign. If I want to get to my privileged executive where I have the highest level of access as far as configuration or executing commands to get to the scratch prompt, we actually use the command enable to get there. But I don't want to go right straight to scratch. I don't want to go right straight to the privileged executive mode without supplying a password as well. And that would be called the, would you believe, the enable password. So let's take a look at a router. Let's go into it and take a look at how these configurations actually work. Oops, let me move my graphics for now. If I take a look at my router, so we have router 1. This is just another small configuration that we've used. I'll bring this up a few different times for you just to give me some sample machines to work with. This is our packet tracer infrastructure. If I bring up the router, so this is just R1. If I hit enter, because it says press return to get started, notice I'm sitting at that greater than sign. And I've actually done a slight configuration here. I changed the host name of my router to R1. Again, amazingly enough, the command in Cisco is host name to change the host name. So I've changed my host name to R1, but it didn't ask me for any passwords. And if I actually type enable to get to privileged executive mode, once again, it does ask me for a password because I actually already configured it here. So, what did I set the password to? I set it to tractor, amazingly enough. So again, that's what we want to see. We want to be able to see us getting into this particular device, and we want to have a password put in place. We're going to have to stop and start over. I had to stop and reconfigure Packet Tracer. So this is the same slides 140 to 142 that we were looking at before. There was a graphic before this where I drew, and now I'm into this Packet Tracer simulation. This needs to just be inserted. You can see that there was a mistake. There was a problem that came up. So just cut the Packet Tracer out and then restart this. Let me get rid of the graphics on here, then I'll get talking. All right, you can figure out. I'm just going to wipe the whole thing out. All right. All right, so we're going to bring up the router interface. Notice that I pressed return to get started as the graphic, the text is sitting in my command line interface for router 1, R1. When I hit enter, when I press return to get started, I hit enter, it just gives me this greater than sign with R1. And notice also that I've changed the name, the default configuration from router to R1, so I know which router I'm in. I've done a couple of different configuration pieces on this router, given it some IP addresses just so that my lights will come up and blink the way that I want them to. It looks actually good for me. But right now we're just really concerned with setting up the security aspect behind this router, and we want to set the passwords. I don't want to get to this prompt without having to supply a password. This would be my out-of-band password where I press return to get started. This would be my console prompt, my console line. So I'm going to need to configure a console line password to be able to control when I get in here. When I telnet to another device, that's actually coming in band. Well, I'll need to set the telnet password instead of the telnet line. And it's kind of a weird thing. In Cisco, we don't call it the telnet line, we call it the VTY line. It's the virtual teletype line. Again, I don't know why they didn't change that back to the word telnet, but telnet and VTY, same thing. So that's what we'll go in, we'll configure the VTY line if I want to protect my in-band components, my in-band security, set my in-band security password. So the other thing that we want to set up here as well is if I want to get to privileged executive mode, this is user executive. If I want to get to privileged executive mode, I type the word enable. It takes me right to my scratch prompt, to my hashtag or my pound sign, whatever that you want to call it. And we typically call it a scratch. So if I want to get to my scratch prompt, this is a privileged executive mode. I would like to have a password in here as well. So that means I need to set my enable password. Right now, none of these passwords are set, so we'll go through and just set them, give us a chance to see what it actually looks like. I need to be able to get into configuration mode. So again, if you remember, my user executive, my privileged executive allows me to execute commands like telnet, like ping. It allows me to show different configurations. If I wanted to show my running config, I could actually type show running config here, and it will show me the configurations that we have made. If I want to configure my router, if I want to configure my switch, then I have to get into global configuration. So I want to tell the switch or the router that I want to configure it. From where? From the terminal, please. That takes me to global configuration where I'm configuring the router, anything that affects the router globally. Like this is where I would have typed the host name command because that affects the router globally. What I really want to change is I want to set my console line password. So I need to get into line configuration mode. That's line console. I have to specify which console port to get into. There's only one, but the way that the operating system works, you still need to specify which one it is. It is an ordinal-based system, so line console 0 is the console line. Notice that my prompt changes to config-line. I now know I'm configuring my console line. How do I know from my prompt? I don't know which one I'm doing, but I can tell them in line configuration mode. I want to set my password for the console line. So I'll set the password to, let's set it to console, just to make life easy for us. Again, not a recommendation in the real world. Another interesting sideline here about putting this command in here, you might think that by putting in the password console command, it would actually set the password to console, and that would require the router or the switch to ask you for it. It doesn't. It just sets the password. If you want to require a user to log in, you also have to specify the login command. Whoops, login. The combination of those two commands actually will now force me to do a login, a password, to supply a password when I get to my user executive mode. So if we go actually all the way out, just to see this in action. So here's my press return to get, whoops, I didn't go far enough out. Here's my press return to get started. I press return to get started, just following the instructions. It's now asking me for a password. This is my console password. So I type in console here. Again, because I used console as the password, so I would remember what it was, that allows me in. Again, if I type enable to get to privileged executive, oh my gosh, we didn't set a password on that yet. So once I've logged in as a lower end user or a non-privileged user, I still should be having to supply an enable password. So how do we set that? Well, I would go back to my global configuration. I want to configure from the terminal, please. And I would set my enable password to be, let's set the enable password to be Cisco. That will make my life good. Now, you know what we're going to do? We're going to actually set the enable password to Tractor. We will get a Cisco password here shortly. Tractor, there we go. Not my real password. Not a good password to use, not very secure. It's a word, but it will actually force me now to put in a password when I want to get to privileged executive mode. I go back out. There's my press return to get started. What am I going to do? I'm going to press return or enter to get started. I supply the console password, which is console. Now I wanted to go to privileged executive mode where I have to go to get to the next configuration prompt as well. So I type enable. It's asking me for another password. That's the enable password, which was tractor. There we go. So now I've protected myself at least from this machine. I have to supply, if I'm going to console and if I'm going to use out-of-band management, I have to supply my console line, and then I also have to supply my enable password. What if I want to telnet into this router? So let me drop out of here for a second. Let me go to my other router, R2 over here. R2 prompt comes up. Make this a little bit bigger. Let me slide that down so we can see everything here. That should work for us. I'll hit enter a few times here. Again, didn't ask me for a password. I haven't put any protection on R2. Enable. Ooh, I do have a password here. I had done that previously. TRACTOR is tractor. Same password I was using on R1. Now I want to telnet to R1. So I'm going to telnet to the IP address of R1, which is 192.168.20.1. Trying, open, connection closed. Why was it closed? We didn't set a password yet. Again, how did I know the IP addresses? Again, they're on my little diagram here. If you see that the router between router 2 and router 1, it's on the 192.168.20 network. The router 1 side is .1, the router 2 side is .2, so that's where I got the IP addresses from. I can't connect into my router. Why is that? Well, if I go back over to R1 and I look at it, and I want to look at my configuration here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say show running configuration. That lets me see the running configuration file. It shows me what I've configured on this router right now. When I look at it, first thing I see, here's the actual words that I typed, enable password tractor. That sets my enable password. I'm going to hit the space bar because I've got the word more at the bottom here, so I'm going to more down to the bottom. I hit the space bar, takes me down a page at a time. There's the command under line console 0 that I put in, password console and login. I didn't configure anything on the VTY. This is the default. VTY is my telnet lines, but see the word login here? That word login, which is there by default on the telnet lines, says you must log in. But with no password specified, the user can't get into the system because there's no parameter to enter. So kind of a security thing here that we do to start with, or Cisco did to start with, is they always by default require you to log into line VTY, but with no password, the connection closes immediately. So if I want to be able to telnet into this router, what I need to specify is the telnet password, just like we did the console password. So let's go ahead and add that in. If I go to my global configuration, so I want to configure from the terminal, I'm going to go to line VTY 0, which is the first line. And actually in Cisco, they have 5 virtual lines, so 0 through 4 is the range. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's 5 different telnet lines, so we're configuring all 5 lines at the same time. I only physically have one console port. So line console 0 is the one physical port that I have. VTY is virtual. It's software defined. I can have multiple virtual sessions, virtual users that are coming in here through this virtual teletype, virtual terminal. So we actually allow, by default, to configure up to 5 users can be telnetted into this router at the same time. So when I type line VTY04, that's taking me into line configuration mode for my telnet lines. The word login is already here. I'm going to specify my password. What should we use for a password? We want to use telnet. Makes my life easy. You can always type login just to make sure it's there anyway. It doesn't hurt it if you type it again. I exit out of here. If I do a show run, which is show running configuration, and I spacebar all the way down to the bottom, you can see that that password telnet is now underlined VTY04. So if I jump back to R2 now, where it was closed before, if I try the exact same command again, and again, what I'll use is a shortcut, I'm going to press the up arrow to get my command back, telnet to 192.168.20.1. This time it's going to ask me for a password. We've just configured the password. The password was telnet, T-E-L-N-E-T. Notice my prompt changes to R1. I've telnetted in. This is in-band management. From R2, I telnetted into R1, and I can now configure R1 from a distance. So again, I could plug my console port in, but what if R1 is 500 miles away in a remote office, and I want to be able to configure it? That's what we use telnet for, or SSH. Again, we use telnet here. SSH is more encrypted. There's a little bit more to setting it up. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. So for ease of use, ease of demonstration, for out-of-band management, we'll go ahead and use our telnet session to get into there. I want to leave. I'll exit out of here. I'm gone. Notice my prompt changes back to R2. I've closed that session to my that remote router, and I'm just sitting at router 2 now. Let me go back to R1 where I was doing my configurations, point out a couple other things to you that you've probably seen so far, but it doesn't hurt to reiterate. We have our 2 configuration files, the running configuration and the startup. Running configuration lives in RAM. The startup configuration lives in NVRAM. We only ever modify the RAM version. So in fact, if I do my show running configuration, we can see, I actually put an extraneous pipe in there by mistake. Sorry about that. Show running config, all the way to the bottom. There's my console password. There's my telnet password. There's my enable password, all in clear text, by the way. But if I do a show startup config, which is the other configuration file, this is the one that if the router has to reboot, this is what it will use. Notice that we don't have any console password, no VTY password, and we have no enable password, which would be right in here. So if I reboot this router right now, all that information is gone because it's only in RAM. You always want to remember to save your configuration by doing a copy, running config, startup config. Again, it's copy source destination. So we're copying from the running config to the startup. That's saving our configuration. If I show my startup configuration again, I now see that I have my enable password and I have my console and telnet passwords. Again, so this is setting up that security for that front end to get into this device. Sure would be nice if these were encrypted somehow. We do have that functionality for at least for the enable password. We can use an MD5 encryption. It's a secret. Again, if it's hashed, it's secret, right? I don't know what it is. So I can actually, instead of setting the enable password, I set the enable secret. Let me go back into global configuration, configuring from the terminal, which is where I'm sitting here. If I want to set the enable secret, that would be the MD5 hashed password. That would be the protected password. From here, I set the enable secret to Cisco, for example. I exit out of here. I'll exit all the way out. Oops, shouldn't have gone all the way out because now I have to put my console password back in. Enable password. What did we use before? We used Tractor, and I just set it to Cisco. So let me do Tractor. Tractor won't work. Once I set a secret password, I can only use the secret password. So I'll use Cisco now. If I show my running config, I moored all the way to, I spacebarred all the way to the bottom. But notice the words enable password Tractor are still here, but Tractor doesn't work. This is the representation. This is my level 5 password, my MD5 password. That is the hashed value of what Cisco is. So now Cisco works for me. However, my other password is still sitting here in clear text. Cisco offers one other service to us. Not necessarily the most secure service in the world, but a service nonetheless, which allows me to do a password encryption of all the clear text passwords that live in the file. The service is called password encryption, amazingly enough. How do I activate it? I would type service password encryption. So I'll go back to my global config. I'm configuring from the terminal again. Service password encryption. That turns that service on. If I come back out here and do a show run now, you're going to see that all my passwords are encrypted. So this is my enable password. This is a level 7 password. This is Cisco's encryption. And there's my level 7 password encrypted word Tractor. Notice I'm using the word encrypted, and I'm saying encrypted. I'm enforcing encrypted. Encrypted implies decryption. You cannot typically decrypt passwords. The MD5 hash is a hash. It's not an encryption. It's a one-way algorithm. There is no undo for an MD5. I can't undo it. I can keep guessing passwords until the hash matches. That works, but I can't undo it. Cisco's service password encryption actually makes this an decryptable function. Very easy. And there's several different places that you can go to actually put that value in and actually decrypt the password. So it's really not overly useful. Why is it here? In my opinion, Cisco did it for shoulder surfing, so that if someone's standing behind me and they see the password, if the password were Tractor, it would be very easy for you to remember that. If you look at my screen, you see that the password is 08355E4F0A0D0A05. You go, I'm not sure I can remember that. As a technician, as someone looking at the screen, if you can write it down, then it'd be very easy for you to go in and decrypt it. How would you do that? Again, if you wanted to, you could go into a Google page. There's a lot Google page. You can just Google for Cisco encryption, decryption, and there's a lot of different web pages that you can just copy that into and actually see what the password is. I suppose I can do that for you. Let me grab this. I'm going to copy that. Let me grab a browser. Make it a little bit smaller here so it can actually fit and you can see what's going on. A little bit shorter. There we go. We got it. That's perfect. So if I were to do Cisco password decrypt. Here's a Cisco 7 password decrypt utility. From here, I can just paste that value in, hit submit. It tells me that my password is Tractor. Not overly secure. So again, it's better than nothing as far as keeping clear text out of there, but not necessarily the best solution for your encryption. Again, that's our initial setup to make sure that we have our router and or our switch. It's the same functionality either way. Bear in mind, I didn't save this configuration yet, so my whole service password encryption isn't there anymore. So I do want to do a copy running config, startup config to make that change stick for me, and now it'll be there the next time. I'll point out one more thing for you, that there is no service password decryption. So like other line items in Cisco, if I want to turn something off, if I want to disable something, I just put the word no in front of it. So if I say no service password encryption, that shuts the encryption functionality off. It does not decrypt the passwords. If I do a show run and you look at it, the passwords are still encrypted. There's the passwords we had before. Here's my password Tractor. So just by turning the service off doesn't mean we're decrypting them. They're still encrypted. If I want to have them decrypted, I have to go back in and change it. So I'll change my enable password back to Tractor. I'm not running that service that encrypts it anymore, so when I show the running configuration, you can actually see the word Tractor again. Again, not necessarily the most secure, but certainly something you'd want to do, at least for shoulder surfing, and make sure that people aren't looking in your screens. Again, that would be our initial setup for at least securing our devices initially.